Bitcoin is an idea that for many people, when understood, inspires an unshakable sense of hope and optimism for a brighter tomorrow. And our guest today is someone with a unique and special talent for translating those feelings into beautiful and imaginative works of film and print. Tomer Strolight is editor-in-chief at Swan BItcoin, and he's joined us today to share a conversation around what he's learned about how people learn about Bitcoin as a result of the work that he's created. I'm Scott Dedels. I'm the CEO and founder of Block Rewards. Part of our mission in bringing Bitcoin to the workplace is helping people understand how it will help them. So if you're interested to learn about how Bitcoin inspires an unshakable sense of hope for a brighter tomorrow, stick around. This episode hits the spot. All right, welcome to another episode of the Block Reward podcast. Very thrilled. Special guest this week, someone who I'm a huge fan of myself, Tomer Strolight from Swan BItcoin. Tomer, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Scott. Good to be here.
I guess we're going to have a lot to talk about over the course of the show. For people who are maybe new to Bitcoin or are not familiar with you, could you just give us like a 30-second TLDR of yourself and your journey?
Yeah, my pre-Bitcoin journey, I had a business degree. I worked for a large media company, a newspaper company principally during the early part of my career, which witnessed the internet come into popularity and destroy newspapers. I was responsible for the digital strategy, so it was kind of an awkward position to be in, growing the thing that was destroying the rest of the business, but it was what it was. I learned a lot about disruptive technologies there, ended up leaving there in 2012, doing a bunch of management and private equity in private equity invested companies. And when I was doing private equity, I was getting like 5 business pitches a day to make investments. And people would always ask me, what do you think this business is worth based off of their PowerPoint presentation? Usually, and I would say I would joke, I would say somewhere between 0 and all the money in the world. And then in 2013, someone introduced me to Bitcoin, and I read the white paper and thought about it for a bit. And I said, oh my God, this is either going to be worth 0 or all the money in the world. So my Bitcoin turned my joke around on me. And increasingly, I became more and more persuaded that it was not going to be worth 0. And in 2021 or 2020, I decided I had been wanting to work in Bitcoin for a long time. As from 2013 on, I dedicated a lot of my time, personal time, to Bitcoin, but couldn't really find work in Bitcoin. And so in 2021-ish, around the height of the COVID pandemic, I decided to just throw caution to the wind and share everything that I could share about Bitcoin. So I wanted to write about Bitcoin, and I started writing about it. One thing led to another. I got picked up by Swan to turn my articles into a book, to write a newsletter for their newly formed private division at the time. And now I'm editor-in-chief at Swan BItcoin. And I love Bitcoin. I love Bitcoiners. I love what the movement stands for. And I'm thrilled to be able to dedicate my time and my energy to advancing Bitcoin and its cause.
You also have a very special talent for articulating some of these ideas, which I think we'll talk about some and point our listeners to in the show notes. That really put you on my radar was Bitcoin is Beautiful, and which is kind of a short 5-minute video that is maybe about a year old. So the evolution of from writing to producing these to your videos, can you talk a little bit about? Yeah,
sure. So I started writing. I thought I call it gimmick, but my talent was I could write very concisely and very clearly. So I set myself initially a goal of writing these short pieces that were going to be like 2 to 3 minutes to read. Each one covered a different piece of Bitcoin, and that they would be informative and instructive to both newcomers and experienced Bitcoiners. And I really cut my teeth on that. But when I was done that, and that became a book that I wrote called Why Bitcoin, it turned into a book. But after I did that, I had all this longer form stuff that I wanted to write. And in the process of writing the book, I also realized that I went from explaining why Bitcoin existed, what it was, to all these kind of spiritual connections that people had to it, like why it brought out hope and love and peace and all these kinds of things. If you read through the book, it becomes quite spiritual towards the end. I don't mean religious. I just mean talking about those emotional, intangible aspects of Bitcoin, the non-financial aspects of it. And so after that, I had this big burst of writing about deeper takes on Bitcoin. And the more that I explored those takes, the more I realized just how wonderful and beautiful Bitcoin was. And one day I took my little dictation machine and just walked through the forest in the springtime when all the flowers were out and everything. And I was just commenting on how beautiful nature is, how beautiful life is, and tying it to Bitcoin and talking about how beautiful humanity was. And that was something that got picked up and turned into a movie. Your question is to like, how did I get into making movies? So I was writing these deep takes on Bitcoin, and someone who had bought, you can see there's a work by an artist over here. His name is Fractal Encrypt. And I had written about his artwork and about how this was just at the rise of the NFTs and how physical artwork was real and took effort, and how NFTs weren't taking effort and were scams. And the person who bought one of his works for a significant amount of money reached out to me and asked me to write an essay because he liked my writing about Bitcoin being generational wealth. And it took me a while to write it, but as soon as I had written it and I had read it out loud to myself and to a coach of mine, I was like, this shouldn't be an article. This should be a movie. So I went to that benefactor who asked me to write it. And I said, can I turn this into a movie? And he said, oh, by all means, do you think you can? And for a small amount of money, I thought I could, because at a Bitcoin meetup, I had just met a director. And so I approached him about making it into a movie. And Bitcoin is Generational Wealth got made into a movie. And it was a very big success. It came out in November 2021. And lots of people loved it. It made people cry. Lots of people hated it too. They didn't understand that it was a projection of the future. They thought it was a documentary. And how could you project the future in a documentary? But for people who haven't seen it, who are Bitcoiners, who want to see the expression of hope and understand where Bitcoin fits in the world, that's a good movie. And then a few months later, after I'd written this Bitcoin is Beautiful piece, which you're referring to, the director of that movie said he'd read the article that I wrote and wanted to make a movie out of that too. So I really got into this idea of, wow, I can reach so many more audiences, and I can reach them emotionally and visually with movie making. So I really had this hunger to make more movies. And I'm finally being able to satiate that hunger with the release of my most recent film, The Legendary Treasure of Satoshi Nakamoto. And in each case, I'm not really the filmmaker, right? I've been hooked up with, Bitcoin has hooked me up with other Bitcoiners who are filmmakers who are enthusiastic about taking my content and turning it into a film. And I couldn't be happier. So it's a win-win.
I do definitely want to come back to The Treasure of Satoshi. But before we do, I think there's an interesting thing to just stop on for a second. And it's this notion that you're sort of, I think part of the reason why your films resonate so much with Bitcoiners is that you're putting a visual towards a feeling of an imagination of the hope that you're talking about. And there's a theme in your work that relates to the journey of sort of technically understanding Bitcoin to then internally understanding it and what happens kind of as a result of that growing understanding. And maybe you could just share your own feelings on that. And was that something that unfolded for you? And that was how?
I think for me, there was always the thing that really appealed to me about Bitcoin when I first heard about it. And it wasn't very clear to me how, but it felt like maybe this is the thing, is that it, in what seemed to me to be a very unjust and unfair world, a world that really rewarded deception and crime and, particularly financial crime, counterfeiting, in a broken system. Bitcoin seemed to be a system that represented justice and was unbreakable and was inviolable. And there was something so pure and gorgeous about that, so justifiable. And so I kept digging and digging and digging. And I would forget about that aspect of it for a while as I became fascinated with cryptography or how nodes work or decentralization or how the blockchain worked or how signatures work. All these kinds of things became rabbit holes, as people say, that I went down and I forgot about them. But I would always come back out of those deep dives into the technology of Bitcoin and think about the philosophy of it, and not just any branch of philosophy of it, like its metaphysics, but in particular its ethics. And I ended up writing with quite a few pieces about the meaning of Bitcoin, and that it's this ethical thing, that it takes this idea that, thou shalt not steal and turns it into thou cannot steal. And it represents the construction of a moral machine, a machine that enforces certain rules of morality in an unbreakable way. And that is, I think, one of the biggest parts of the breakthrough of what Bitcoin is. It enforces a morality that prevents people from inflating, debasing, stealing money. And money is where hardworking, honest people store the efforts of the value that they've created for other people. It's the store of value. And Bitcoin works as an ethical store of value that can't be cheated or robbed away. There's no game to play. And that's what's so astounding about this, that it can bring out a more ethical society and give us hope that, and give us a reason to behave ethically, lure people back away from evil and, and cheating and lying and politicking and counterfeiting in order to make money, and instead into trading value for value, as Bitcoiners often say.
It makes me think of one of the phrases that you have written is Bitcoin isn't just money, it's money that is just.
Yeah, right. Yeah, no, I mean, it's really extraordinary. And we've never had that before. Fiat money certainly is unjust money, if ever there was an unjust money. But with gold, it didn't have, gold required work to get it out of the ground, but often that would have been slave labor or something. And gold, you have to keep it by force. Wars have been fought, countless wars practically have been fought, where the prize is the winner gets to keep the gold of the loser. And so it has an incentive to spill blood and to take it by force. You can't take Bitcoin by force, and you can't destroy Bitcoin by force. So you can't increase your share through violence and murder. And that's yet another extraordinary feature of it, beyond simply the fact that it can't be debased, inflated away, that nobody can change its rules, that it has no rulers. So there's a lot of dimensions here of the beauty of this invention that's only just now creeping into use in human civilization. So we haven't even seen the tip of the iceberg of what's possible when cast aside these terrible things that have always been associated with money, the uncertainty about its future, the uncertainty about your future ability to hold on to it, whether it's your share of the wealth or the actual money that you have, has always been, hope. Or if you're really insecure about it, then you will have done something which is built up an army which needs to be paid, so you pay it with the spoils of attacking another army.
We were talking offline about this idea before we started recording, and it's not just a sort of transformational rewiring that happens at an individual level, but when that is simultaneously happening for multiple individuals, then you have this really cool cascading effect that we're starting to watch really, gain a critical mass right now, where there's people having its simultaneous awarenesses and a growing evolution as being a part of the conversation.
Yes, this is one of the things that gets mislabeled as, Bitcoin is a cult. Look, all these Bitcoiners think alike. Well, we're all reaching independently, thoughtfully, very similar conclusions. We're all exposed to the same real world. We're all exposed to seeing what's happening with Bitcoin, what's happening with fiat money. And many of us are having similar ideas. Many of us write similar things. We consume similar things that have high resonance, get broadly consumed. And Bitcoin isn't an organization that has people with specific roles in it that, and only one person's hired for each role, or only 5 people. Anyone can participate at any point in time in any role that they want to do for Bitcoin. If it's unsound, their ideas will be ignored or rejected. But if it's sound, it'll add to the complement of everything, and they don't have to be hired by Bitcoin. So there aren't all these people who want to work for Bitcoin who are prevented from working for Bitcoin. And so what this creates is something very different than a typical corporate organization. It's a come and go as you please, do what you're passionate and excellent at, get the feedback from it, and share it with everybody for free. So it's very, very different from come and do a specific job that you've been hired for that nobody else is allowed to do, and that you will be evaluated on by one manager, and it'll have to fit into the top-down strategy as determined by the CEO and the executive team. It's exactly the opposite. It's not even just bottoms up. It's like from all around. And I think that creates all sorts of interesting synchronicities. You'll read something, you're like, oh my God, I was just thinking the same thing and working on the same thing. Well, there's no surprise. We're all involved, and we're all exchanging data constantly back and forth through all this medium. I wrote one piece, which was kind of interesting because there were quite a few people who'd written about, well, is Bitcoin alive or not? And I wanted to take it to is Bitcoin conscious and intelligent or not? And so I wrote a piece called How Bitcoin is Like a Giant Cybernetic Meta Brain. And it really is, like your brain is made up of millions of neurons, billions perhaps. And they're just each of these little things that they follow others. They have connections from others and they broadcast to other neurons. And somehow through the electrical flow of impulses through that, your consciousness arises, right? But there's no one neuron that is you. I can take any one neuron. I can take hundreds of neurons out of your brain and you'd still be you. You might forget a thought here or a memory there, but the you is not, it's decentralized, right? There's no one neuron in you and there's no neuron that's in control of the other neurons. They all participate in an egalitarian structure where they're all free to receive and they're all free to send information. So there's this comparison that I draw between us plebs communicating over social media and neurons in our minds and how consciousness arises from that effect. And so I feel like Bitcoin is in that sense conscious, and we are part of its consciousness. And we are always thinking how to solve the problems that Bitcoin is confronting. We may have debates, just like in your mind, you may be torn between, should I go left? Should I go right? Should I fast? Should I eat meat? Should I eat bread? There's all these torn decisions, and you see the exact same thing playing out in the Bitcoin community. It's not a top-down structure like a corporation. It's much more a distributed organization like a human brain.
And you see that when one sort of node or tries to assert a disproportionate amount of influence over the consciousness, and there's sort of like an immune response that tends to happen.
Yeah, if it doesn't resonate with the rest of the organ, then it gets rejected. Sometimes it is very fascinating and cascades through much of the organ and eventually overwhelms and gets a persuasive position. Bitcoin does have this ability to transform itself when it has this, what it considers a good idea, but it's also very conservative because people recognize that, a big change could turn out to be fatal even. So it's survival is the primary thing. And again, that's where Bitcoin looks a lot more like an organism than a corporation. Corporations are dying left, right, and center, oftentimes because people at the top make decisions that are good for the person at the top and not for the livelihood of the organization. They lever it up, introducing tons of risk to it, but increasing the value of their stock, options. Bitcoin doesn't do that. Bitcoin doesn't issue stock options. It doesn't issue them in proportion. It has no leadership. It wants to survive. And the people who hold Bitcoin want those Bitcoin to survive. They want to hold them for the long term. So once again, we have something that's much more akin to an organism that wants to survive and that really can survive. It's got all these amazing defenses for the sake of survival versus a corporation that exists at the whim of its leadership, the government, its shareholders, its customers, all sorts of things.
It makes me think, to your point about anyone is free to come and go. Bitcoin, it's the most efficient market in the world, and it's maybe almost also the most efficient recruiting agency in the world. There's no barriers of recruitment for Bitcoin, and it's sort of the most viral idea that's ever existed.
Yeah, like if you want to work for Bitcoin, you don't have to apply for a job. You just do the work. If you want to develop software, just start writing software. You have to be competent at it, or you will be rejected by the whole of the network. But you don't have to apply and compete against somebody else who's also applying for the job. And you don't have to wait for somebody to write the job description that suits what you think you can do. Like, you are in charge of Bitcoin. You are in charge of your relationship with Bitcoin, and you can make it be whatever you want it to be. And so Bitcoin really brings out it challenges you to say, well, what do you want to do for Bitcoin if you want to work for Bitcoin? And then it says, okay, I'm not going to stop you. I'm not going to tell you it's a bad idea. Do it. Do what you think is good and learn through the process and get better and better and better. And I think this is also part of the reason why we see so many people have these, phenomenal ideas and introduce them into the system. And then those things get integrated. There wasn't some meeting that said, how do we create the Lightning Network? It was like a couple of people were, thinking really hard about how to scale Bitcoin, and they had this idea, and then they presented the idea to the Bitcoin community rather than the Bitcoin community said, okay, we're going to have a request for an RFP process, a request for proposal, and people will propose different scaling solutions, and then we'll choose one and we'll build it based off of what the committee decides. There's nothing of this sort, right? Some people showed up and they said, we've got the idea for the Lightning Network. And people said, wow, that's a great idea. Let's build it.
Entirely organic. It makes me think about like, there's a lot of people, if you spend a lot of time thinking about Bitcoin, like a lot of Bitcoiners do, I think it can be easy to impose your own anxiety or these are internal things around, when it's going to do this or that and whether it's doing something at the right speed, fast enough. And you see a lot of proclamations on Twitter about Bitcoin needing to do this or Bitcoin needs to do that. And it makes me think about like, it's sort of like it's going to do whatever it's supposed to do on whatever time that it's going to do it. It's like this is the nature of something that is decentralized in this way.
Yeah. I think that the danger is in saying and not saying I think. It's a danger in not saying I think Bitcoin needs to do this, but saying Bitcoin needs to do this. Because the minute you remove yourself from the equation and you make a statement that's overarching and not subjective, you're presuming for Bitcoin and every other Bitcoiner that you're right. And so this is where, again, stay humble comes in. Bitcoin will humble you. You've convinced yourself that Bitcoin needs bigger blocks or something. And, you're so convinced that you actually hard fork Bitcoin and build a version of Bitcoin with bigger blocks and nobody comes. And Bitcoin keeps on ticking away. And now you start to go deranged because you are so convinced that Bitcoin needs to have bigger blocks, that you created bigger blocks and you sold all your old Bitcoin and you bought all these units in your big block Bitcoin and nobody's coming along. And you're convinced that you're right. So you end up living in a completely different reality than the one that the majority of people, it's like you took a piece of your brain out and you put it aside that believes something else, and it's no longer attached to the rest of your brain, like the hard fork example is. I'm losing the words here, and it's an amputation from the system, right? So when you amputate yourself from the system and you can't rejoin, that can lead to derangement.
Yeah, it's kind of an interesting way to think about like a shared reality versus living in your own reality.
Yeah, I think this again, and I think this is true. Right? It's not to say people who are in crypto and not in Bitcoin are insane, but they don't live in the same reality. They're trying to live in a different kind of reality than what Bitcoiners are, and Bitcoin keeps winning. Right? There's all these little communities find it hard, like not for the community to continue to exist, but for the community to grow and thrive, because eventually more and more people, like the way back into Bitcoin is to sell your altcoins and buy Bitcoin instead and resume participation in the network. And, many newcomers don't know where to go. So they have to go through a learning process to get there. But for the people who leave and have too much of an ego to reevaluate and then come back, that's where this Bitcoin derangement syndrome really kicks in. And there's different flavors of it now, because now there's people who are building stuff on Bitcoin that isn't really Bitcoin, and they hate all the old Bitcoiners. So there's different flavors of derangement, but they're ultimately all the same. It's like if you separate yourself from the mind, from the organ, then you're separate from the organ and you experience a different reality, or, you're not cheering for Team Bitcoin. You're not excited when the Bitcoin price rises, or when El Salvador accepts Bitcoin as legal tender, or when, something really positive happens to Bitcoin. You're busy rationalizing away why this is the end of Bitcoin, why it's terrible, why bad things happen to Bitcoin, and Bitcoiners acknowledge it, but Bitcoiners fix it with Bitcoin, whereas the outsiders to Bitcoin think, oh, this might be my chance for my coin, my Nano or my Bitcoin Cash or my XRP to finally show what it's made out of. And it never shows what it's made out of because it's not made out of the same.
Yeah. Thinking about all those different qualities you've listed, knowing them, then it's hard to imagine anything that could outcompete in terms of innovation or robustness. Like this thing that has the capacity to recruit anyone who's willing to participate.
Yeah, it's a fail. The community would have to fail, right? Like people often ask, what's Bitcoin's greatest vulnerability? And I say, well, if the Bitcoiners become complacent, because as long as the Bitcoiners are not complacent, Bitcoin is really invulnerable. right? It's like every human being on earth would have to die, right? It's that severe, and to really stop Bitcoin from continuing to function. And Bitcoiners are quite vigilant, right? They're not only not complacent, they're actively vigilant about protecting the network, growing the network, increasing its utility, increasing its value. They're not ignorant about what else is going on in the space and in the world in general. It's like, wow, Bitcoiners think about so many different disciplines, from economics to environment to energy to finance to politics. It's just right across the board. Education, nutrition, right? There's nothing that's stopping Bitcoiners from connecting how a good money can play a role in any of these disciplines, and how a bad money has potentially poisoned some of these disciplines. So that's where the fix the money, fix the world expression comes from. And many Bitcoiners are saying, there's a lot of different fixes to a lot of things that we have to admit to ourselves really are broken, or aren't functioning as well as they could, aren't functioning as well as they have in the past, and can't be fixed from within the system. They need to be fixed from outside the system. And that's what Bitcoin is. It's this external fix to a system that internally is already broken, the fiat system and Western liberal democracies along with them.
Hey, everybody. I'm thrilled to announce that Block Rewards has come on board as a sponsor for the 2024 Canadian Bitcoin Conference, happening in Montreal, May 16th to the 18th. It's going to be a great event with an unreal lineup of speakers, and we couldn't be more excited about being involved. If you're thinking about going and you don't have your tickets yet, you get 10% off of your pass using the code BLOCK2024, and that's all capital letters. And you can get those tickets at CanadianBitcoinConf.com. Hope to see you there.
Thanks.
It's an idea that is sort of incubating and moving more and more towards a moment in time where it's almost like when inflation is 2%, as it has been, or whatever numbers, when inflation was less observable to the average person, which was the case over most of Bitcoin's lifespan, the average person didn't really have a reason to, be drawn to these things unless maybe it was by accident. But as the grocery bills are growing on sort of a weekly or monthly, it's becoming harder and harder to ignore. And do you think we're headed towards some sort of like an inflection point where this idea gains a critical mass? Or
well, it depends what you mean by critical mass. There's people who talk about overnight hyper-Bitcoinization. I don't think that's going to happen because of the nature. The people can't hyper-Bitcoinize, right? Like it's going to take a long time for people. And I can't remember which physicist this statement is attributed to, but he said physics doesn't move with discoveries, it moves with funerals, right? And he says like the people at the top have to literally pass away for the new ideas to be embraced and accepted. And that is definitely something that we will see more of, like the most intransigent people about when it comes to accepting Bitcoin are people who've been in positions of financial power and political power for a very long period of time. We can't expect them to turn around quickly. Like an election cycle is 4 years, right? And changing banking regulations or banking systems is really, really slow. It's all of these things are as slow as Bitcoin development, right? Bitcoin exists within the realm of these things. It's not a move fast, break things. It's a move slow and build with stability thing. So I think it's going to take a long time for the full potential of Bitcoin to be realized. But I think like if we look at Bitcoin and its various epochs, these 4-year periods between halvings, I think this one's going to be really interesting because the writing on the wall will become much clearer. This is like when the internet was first starting, it was a few people in universities who used it, really kind of like how Bitcoin started, and it was just a few cryptographic cypherpunks and people who wanted to buy and sell drugs online were using, right? So it was very niche, very underground. Eventually, the internet hit a breaking point, which to me, I think I would describe as like when people got always on high speed connections in their homes, right? It started off with these dial up. You had to get a modem. It wasn't even included in your computer. You had to plug your phone into it. And then you had to connect to the internet manually and it was slow, right? Aren't these the same, these are the same complaints about Bitcoin today. It's slow. You have to use it manually. It's confusing. Hardly anybody uses it. What's it good for, right? And then the high speed internet started to be introduced. And when it was always on, and easy to use, you started to use it more readily and more frequently. And I think that's kind of the inflection point that we're on right now. It still took a long time before, then Wi-Fi came in. So you have internet wirelessly, which meant lots of devices in your house were going to suddenly connect to it, not just one. And not only that, then that created mobility. And then the smartphone came out. And then we had this tipping point where billions of people were connected to the internet. Boom. And they did everything on it. And the internet continues to evolve and consume more and more of our attention and time. Bitcoin's actually built on the internet, right? Like it's riding that, but it's still at this very early stage. And so this epoch, I think, is going to be one where some of the reasons you cited and others too, like worldwide inflation, collapse of, collapsingness, not utter collapse, but more awareness that fiat currencies are collapsing everywhere, a desire to save money, the unaffordability of housing, the overcomplexity of the investing market, all of these things, the corruption of politics, all of these things eventually point to Bitcoin as the solution. And more people are going to hear, well, Bitcoin fixes this and Bitcoin fixes that and Bitcoin fixes this. And they're going to watch people who have Bitcoin get wealthier relative to themselves. And like sooner or later, there's just going to be more and more people signing up for high-speed internet, aka Bitcoin. And so I think we're going to see Bitcoin evolve. We'll see things like the Lightning Network and potentially other layer twos really proliferate, making Bitcoin high-speed, private, secure, all the kinds of things that people are easy, things that people are concerned about for Bitcoin. It's coming. And this will be the period where people become aware that it's coming. It won't have fully come. It won't have fully penetrated everybody, but that'll be a big tipping point. And that'll probably, I'm not one who makes price predictions, but I think it'll have a really big impact on price. It may be a different order of magnitude of price increases that we get towards the back half of this epoch or the beginning of the next one, when it becomes like, yeah, this is the next big thing, and everybody acknowledges it.
Yeah, I love to use the example. You're Canadian too. I don't know what it was like out your way, but for me, the proof in the Bitcoin pudding was when people started feverishly gobbling up toilet paper in 2020, even though there was no evidence that we were going to have some sort of like societal level toilet paper shortage.
You just want to play it safe, right? You don't want to run out of toilet. Of all the things you don't want to run out of, toilet paper is like really high on the list.
I mean, there are other things you can use. It's like,
yeah, there's workarounds, but toilet paper was key. And we saw the rush, and it was a hyper toilet paperization moment. And then they printed more toilet paper, so everything got back to normal in that regard. But the world still hasn't really recovered from those COVID times. I think, at least here in Canada, I see a lot of people who are still sheltered as a result. Something became upset, and the consequent inflation that came with it everywhere in the world, but especially as well here in Canada, is nothing to laugh at. Like, it's been a lot. If you had, this is one of the points I make about it, the insidiousness of inflation with these occasional inflation leaps, is if you had saved all your money and you're close to retirement now, and you thought at certain prices you had enough money to live for 20 years, and now the prices have all doubled. Gas is twice as much as it used to be. Food is more than twice as much as it used to be. These are things you can't not have. You just have to have half as much of. So, you spend all your life savings, and you spend all your life saving money, and all your life savings has essentially been cut in half. What are you going to do? And if you're out of time, you're out of time. And I think that's really the most insidious aspect of inflation, is not that it's quick and vicious. It's slow and and invisible. So you don't see its effects until it's too late. And by then it's too late to do anything about it, because all you can do is not retire, or die, or live in poverty. Like, these aren't good choices.
Yeah, I mean, and this, it plays out on so many different timescales. And this is one of the ideas you captured in Bitcoin is Beautiful is, gradually over time, the physical world that we've built has become a reflection of this degrading money, and we stop building things that are the sort of these timeless architectural masterpieces, and those things are what inspire us.
Beauty in our world, right? Like, and I think that's a really sad thing, and you can look back at it a decade at a time or a century at a time, and you see these phenomena. You see the architecture becoming ugly. You see the stories that are told in movies becoming ugly in a sense, right? Like, I grew up in the 80s, and all the movies they involved friendship, right? And love and friends helping each other out. And then things started to turn where friends were stabbing each other in the back. And now I don't really know what today's movies are just sequels without the same to the movies from the 80s and 90s without the passion from the 80s and 90s. So we're seeing the hope and the humanity sucked out, the beauty sucked out of things. And Bitcoin definitely, as far as I'm concerned, reintroduces it. It's built to last. It's built with elegance and beauty. And it reminds us of the fact that humans can build beautiful things that last forever. And, it being such a thing and the way that it came into existence, all of these things about it make that beauty. And I can see it. I work for a Bitcoin company. The people who work in this company are inspired by that essence and they build things to last and they try to make them beautiful and they try to make them human so that, human beings can interact. I've had the most terrible experience with the cable company in the last few days. It's not built to resolve or satisfy customers. It's built to have a wire that is, energized. And if anything goes wrong, then you're out of luck. And the people working there are kind of in this hopeless position. They've got too many products to sell you. And the whole thing just it's a terrible experience. I get anxiety just thinking that I have to phone or interact with a cable company in any way. And so this is where we have the opportunity to change things and move them and build them in a human way using technology that was never available to us before. And I think that's another thing that's really, really exciting. It's not we're going to have a repeat of the Renaissance. So we're going to have a new Renaissance that is informed by and powered by everything that we've discovered since, but is still human. And then we've just gone through this mini dark age where humanity has been sucked out of our civilization and we're all at each other's throats and we're all frustrated and can't figure out how to run our society and how to come to agreement with one another or how to live with disagreement with each other. It'll come around. And you can see it in Bitcoin, right? Bitcoin, there's a lot of love in the Bitcoin community. And when there's disputes, they get aired at least, right? There's a freedom of speech of airing them. And then there's a resolution eventually where people realize, well, I can't just keep butting my head against somebody else because we're not getting anywhere. And there's somewhere that I want to go. How do we figure out how to get there? And so this is kind of a natural process.
I think about it's listening to you. It makes me feel, Bitcoin is this thought paradigm for showing humanity a new way to come to agreement in a way that makes sense. And it's like, even that idea for people who aren't ready to come, maybe this is part of what makes some people attracted to Bitcoin and other people resistant to it at the start. It's like, because it is a bigger idea than, a money system or how money could work.
The big idea here is consensus or cooperation as opposed to defeat and adversarial nature, right? So you take a look around at the Western liberal democracy and it's competing political parties, one who will lose and one who will win. The court system, it's adversarial with specialists to fight one another, and one side will win and one side will lose. Everything's adversarial, everything's competitive. Bitcoin is cooperative. And interestingly enough, Satoshi took this Byzantine generals problem, which was a war game, a war simulation of these generals who cannot trust each other, and so they cannot come to consensus on anything. And he solved it by turning it into a giant cooperation game, but this most proof of work thing. And so he took war and turned it into peace. He took competition and turned it into collaboration and cooperation. And Bitcoin being this cooperative thing, you can't change it by getting 51% of people to agree with you. That's not how changes in Bitcoin work. You need to overwhelmingly persuade everybody of a view. And that might mean that you have to adjust your view to come in line with what the overwhelming majority of people will accept. You have to figure out how to cooperate. And I think that's so refreshing and so new for us who've lived in this system where everything is based off of competition and play and win by any means necessary, by hook or by crook. It's like, well, no, not by hook, not by crook, but by honest, rational, patient, truthful communication with other people is the only way you're actually going to win the overwhelming majority of you. You're not going to fool the majority of people. You can fool some of the people some of the time, but you can't fool all the people all the time. A famous quote. Well, you can't fool all the people all the time. So you can't get something through Bitcoin that's fooling people. We're all paranoid, right? Or to some degree. So you got to persuade the paranoid even here.
And also, you've eliminated physical coercion from it. So you also can't bully anyone into do it or force anyone.
It's really hard. I mean, we'll see hopefully we'll live to see it, that it'll happen within our lifetimes. But you can imagine that if Bitcoin becomes the world's money, or the money of many of the people of the world, the money of many of the nations of the world, there will be some conflicts. But, and so keeping your Bitcoin secure will become really important. And who knows exactly what will play out, right? A year ago or 2 years ago, we had Jason Lowery writing his thesis about how Bitcoin is going to replace traditional warfare with nonviolent, non-lethal use of electric force, but not violent force. And it's hard to put your finger on exactly what that means, because we're talking about something in the future that we don't really have a lot of experience with right now. But you can certainly see Bitcoiners don't do violence on other Bitcoiners. There's very little of this that's reported, and all you see in the news when you turn it on is violence in our traditional world, where you can compete for resources. You can take them from another person. There's a lot of work we have to do in security and custody and making sure that people don't get robbed when they're using custodians. But that's all part of the future challenges that Bitcoin will grow into.
It's a perfect segue into talking a little bit about the treasure, Satoshi's treasure, which some of what you were just talking about is really the overarching theme of the story. And a brief, lead in, I guess, is the surface level of what Satoshi's treasure is the 1 million Bitcoin sitting in a wallet that Satoshi placed there as proof of the sort of fair entry of the original launch of Bitcoin. But maybe I'll stop there and let you talk a little bit about what Satoshi's treasure is.
Okay, so the legendary treasure of Satoshi Nakamoto, now a film that you can see on YouTube and an article that you can read on Medium. And you can listen to Guy Swan read it on Audible too, apparently. Not apparently, definitely. I sat down to write this piece, which I wasn't calling the legendary treasure of Satoshi Nakamoto when I sat down to write it. I sat down to write it and was going to be called Bitcoin is a Spiritual Awakening. And what I was getting at, and that's the kind of the intro to the piece, it's like the story of Bitcoin ends up causing people to have spiritual awakenings. Why is that? Like, some people become religious, but many people find hope again. They go from hopelessness to hope. And that in and of itself is a spiritual awakening. They believe in something. They believe in humanity. They believe in themselves. They believe that happiness, right? These are all spiritual values. They're not material values. You can't touch happiness. You can't touch hope. Right. So I sat down to write, well, here's why I think it is. And I'd written a number of pieces, but I pointed out it's the story of Bitcoin, which we can actually verify is true, which matters a lot, is this incredible story of hope. There were experts who said that the Byzantine generals' problem could not be solved. They had proven mathematically it could not be solved. And we have the collapsing world economy, in the 2008 financial crisis. And things are just shit, right? And out of nowhere, somebody shows up. We don't know his name. We never hear his voice. We never see his face. And this is all true and all verifiable. He solves the Byzantine general's problem. And with that solution, he uses it to make a spiritual form of money that itself is intangible. It's not from the material world. It can't be touched. And it works better than any other money that's ever worked before. And the more you study it and the more you study the story, the more you come to believe that this is the best form of money. And you're also taken aback by the characteristics of Satoshi Nakamoto. Like, here's someone who did preserve their privacy in an era where nobody's privacy is preserved anymore. And someone who invented something that experts said you couldn't invent. He outsmarted all of the experts. And he didn't do it for money. Like, he didn't keep the money. He left it there. He didn't do it for power. He's not sitting around here saying, well, these people will be able to use Bitcoin. These people won't be able to use Bitcoin. He didn't do it for fame. None of us know we've all heard the name Satoshi Nakamoto. None of us know who he is. He's not sitting there walking down the street and people are telling him, oh my God, you're so great. Come to my party. He's getting none of these benefits of fame, money, and power that, we're told is what we are, right? We're raised and said, look, people are selfish. And it's maybe a religious figure who can be selfless in that sense. But here it is. We've got this invention that flies in the face of all these beliefs that we have, which are all negative. and this person who flies in the face of all these beliefs that we have about ourselves, which are negative. And it shatters all those negative views, the story of Bitcoin. And when you shatter these negative views, you realize all these were myths. It's a myth that I might only do something for money, power, and fame. It's a myth that just because experts say it can't be done, that it can't be done. It's all these things are myths. And so when you shatter those things, you realize, oh my God, I live in a much better world. I live in a world where I could be something excellent. Like I can live for whatever reasons I want to live for. I don't have to believe in the constraints that I'm told are constraints. If I can figure out a solution, I can figure out a solution. And so that to me is where people have a moment of, or a gradual process that leads to a spiritual awakening from being involved in studying Bitcoin. And I go through in this essay how Bitcoin is really pure money, and it allows us, like, when we ask the question, what exactly is money? And we find out that Bitcoin is pure money. It's not adulterated by institutions like central banks or governments or money printers. It's not manipulated by leaders. I mean, it's leaderless. It exists purely independent of any contaminating influences. And we realize that we've seen pure money for the first time in our life. And it also causes us then to ask, well, what are other things that are in their pure state? What is education? What is purified education? Not education as mandated by the state and taught by unionized teachers in classroom curriculum that are mandated by the Ministry of Education or Department of Education, but just learning. How do people learn? How do I learn? What do I want to learn for myself? Not what does somebody else think that I need to be taught in what way? And so there's this opening of every field: nutrition, healthcare, faith, spirituality. All of these things become open to us because we can look at them purely. We can now detach them from the contaminants that have their tentacles wrapped all around them. And so I go through a bunch of these things and point out that Bitcoin awakens the spirit of freedom, because pure money is the exercise of your freedom. And that I won't go into the full explanation of that here. I'll let people watch the movie or read the article to get that. And then when I was writing the article, I thought that would be the end of it. But when I was done it, I heard a voice inside my head say, well, now you're going to know what Satoshi's treasure is really all about, because it's a monument to it's in plain sight. Everyone can see it, but nobody can touch it. Nobody can take it, and it'll be there forever. And so Satoshi actually used his coins. He didn't spend them on a Lamborghini or a yacht, super yacht, or whatever else these multi-billionaires are spending their money on. He didn't try to change the world to his point of view. He left the coins there as a monument to stand forever in homage to what he achieved, right? The ability to create something that will last forever, the ability to do something that experts say can't be done, the ability to do it not for money or power or fame, but for the sake of the human spirit. And that is the closest thing that this monument materially represents. But when you go through and the voice inside my head was telling me, well, that's not even the real treasure. The real treasure is all these virtues you gain by studying Bitcoin that help you discover what the pure, true you is, right? Because you've asked what's pure money, what's pure education, what's pure healthcare, what's pure this. And now you know how to go through a process of purifying things and asking yourself what you really truly are. And I think that's the ultimate journey for most Bitcoiners. It's like, get to the bottom of who you are and what you are. And, to spoil the end, it's like that's the greatest treasure that exists in the universe. It's a one-of-a-kind treasure that will only exist for a short period of time. And it's yours to have if you choose to take it. And Bitcoin can enable you to get there. So that was the piece for me. And when I wrote it or took it down from whatever, signal I was tuned into in the universe, it was really touching and moving. And I heard from a lot of people that when they read it, it moved them to tears. And so I really wanted to make it into a movie really badly, and finally exists now as a movie. And I hope it stands up to, I hope it delivers. I'm getting lots of real positive feedback on it. My favorite feedback that I'm getting, which I'm getting quite a bit of, is that people are watching it with people who aren't Bitcoiners. And the people who aren't Bitcoiners are enthralled and motivated to learn more. I was at a family dinner a couple of weeks ago, just after it was released. And my sister-in-law, who I've never talked to about Bitcoin, who doesn't really have much of an interest in money or economics or politics or any of those thing, said she had just watched it and she said she didn't think she would get through it. She didn't think she would enjoy it, but she not only got through the whole thing, afterwards she started Googling who is Satoshi Nakamoto. And she was asking me like, is it really true that nobody knows who he is? Is it really true that he left behind billions of dollars worth of Bitcoin? Is it really true? I was like, yes, it's all true and it's all verifiable. And I think that's, there's lots of uplifting stories, but they're fiction. Right. And or they're so old and dated that we don't really know what to believe about them and what not to believe about them. We have to deploy faith to say, well, this is a true story and this is what I believe in it, or this doesn't matter if I believe in it. But the story of Satoshi Nakamoto and the creation of Bitcoin, at least for us in the here and now, is a verifiably true story. And it's an uplifting story. So you can see in the real world, these kinds of things can happen. This is not just limited to the realm of fiction and hope, and it's a really cruel world and a vicious world. No, it can be a really beautiful world. We just need to make it so and work towards that and live by these types of ideals.
Yeah, it's really inspiring and uplifting even just to hear you talk about it, Tomer. That was really a cool personal experience. Funny personal side story about the movie. I have this running theory on my own that Satoshi's treasure is the basis for Ready Player One, and that maybe someday in the future it will be Satoshi's treasure that there's some sort of global treasure hunt for.
In that book, there was this now deceased founder of a gaming company, who left all the shares in the company to whoever could figure out the prize of the game. Interesting. Satoshi's coins were mined each to a unique address at a time when we didn't have hierarchical or seed phase addresses. So they were each randomly generated. So it's almost like every 50 coins in Satoshi's treasure of 1 million coins is a Ready Player One prize for someone who can figure it out, unless someone can break elliptic curve cryptography. And then we've got a bit of a problem with Bitcoin. But it's a different kind of game. Like I think Bitcoin's always taking a twist on these legendary stories. And I think with this one, it's like the real treasure that he left behind isn't money. That money is not for you to take. The real treasure is the rediscovery of ourselves as individuals, not as cogs in the economic machinery, replaceable with one another, but as irreplaceable, incredibly valuable individuals who have such uniqueness about them that it's priceless.
Yeah. And so to just give one person's story, I went into watching the video first thinking it was about money and this treasure and Ready Player One. And I didn't know how it ended. And so the end was a really sort of beautiful twist. And I personally had that experience watching it. So thank you. And thank you for all the work you do, man. And your creative projects are such a gift to anyone who's interested enough to check them out.
Well, thank you. I feel blessed that I get to live at a time when Bitcoin exists so that I can do this sort of stuff, so that I can validate for my own sake that I live in a beautiful world and the human beings are beautiful and that there's all this reason to have lots of hope and to share that reason for hope with other people. I mean, that is really, what's the word? I don't know, validating, maybe not the word, but it's really satisfying and it's really uplifting. And it's like, that's a big part of who the pure me is, right? It's someone who is really, really interested in philosophy and spirituality and all these sorts of things and gets to share these ideas with other people in a way that they can appreciate it as well. And so that we can have a connection on that basis.
For listeners that want to find more of you online, or where should they go?
At Tomer Strolight on Twitter, there's a link to my Noster at the very top of that as well. My articles are published on the Swan blogs, the swan.com/blog, and the older ones and many of the ones we discussed here are on Medium. So if you search for Tomer Strolight on Medium, if you want to search for my movies, Tomer Strolight YouTube, you'll find things on a channel, on a Swan channel, and Bit Intelligence is another channel that's been producing many of my essays into short films. So there's like 5 or 6 more in addition to the 3 that we talked about here. Google my name and type podcast afterwards, and you'll find my appearances on a whole bunch of other places as well. And I tend to be on Twitter's Cafe Bitcoin Twitter Spaces a lot. I host it on Wednesdays, and I try to attend it many other days too. So if you actually want to ask me a question in voice live, that's it. And I'm also doing on Thursday afternoons an introduction to Bitcoin Q&A with Brady Swenson at Swan. So there's a lot, and that's on Twitter as well. So there's lots of lots of ways to find me.
Thank you again so much for coming on the show.
Yeah. Thanks for having me.
If you're listening and you made it all the way to the end, thank you for tuning in as well, and hope to see you again next week. Thanks for listening to this episode of The Block Reward. We're trying to do something different here, creating accessible conversations meant for people who aren't obsessed with Bitcoin. If you found this episode informative and engaging, hit that subscribe button to make sure you stay updated with future episodes. Your feedback matters. We'd greatly appreciate it if you could take a moment to share your reviews and help us with our goal of creating Bitcoin content that is simple and easy to understand. Bitcoin has an important role to play in the future of finance. It will change the way we save, spend, and invest. Discover why Bitcoin offers a game-changing opportunity for forward-thinking employers by visiting blockrewards.ca. Block Rewards' mission is helping Canadian employers implement strategies for integrating Bitcoin into compensation and benefits, supercharge your recruitment and retention strategies, and help your team members plan for the rising cost of living by rewarding their work with the hardest money ever invented. Special thanks to our top sponsor, Paramount Employee Benefits Consulting, Canada's only Bitcoin forward benefits and pension advisory. For more information, find them at paramountbenefits.ca. Big shout out to Podigy, our production team that makes all this possible, and BMX Escape for producing our music. Bitcoin is an expansive and dense topic many people walk away from early. To Bitcoin enthusiasts looking for that podcast they can share with friends, family, and colleagues, one they'll actually listen to, we hope that is us. The content of these conversations is meant to be provided for information purposes only. Nothing here is investment advice. Bitcoin is a big topic. Be sure to do your own research before making any personal financial decisions. Thanks for listening.